Hi, this is Paul. I was reading Bethel McGrew's Substack on Brave New World. We are Re-Paganizing. And I caught a little word from her today. There are those Mrs. P. Smith christens the utilitrads, which I thought was a fascinating word. A couple of days ago, I listened to this podcast with Louise Perry, Maiden Mother Matriarch with Ross Douthat. I thought the whole one was excellent. Only a portion of it is on YouTube, unfortunately, and some of the best parts are after the YouTube portion. But the whole thing was very good, and they did get into the whole question of repaganization, and they started talking about Andrew Huberman, which was quite interesting, and maybe we'll just jump in there and then jump around a little bit.
Women's recent travails in relation to polyamory or failed polyamory, I don't know. There's this New York Magazine cover about the fact that he has the famous neuroscientist podcaster has all these girlfriends and he's been deceiving them about the existence of the other girlfriends and so on. And the point you make, which I thought was funny and true, was that in a sense what polyamory is trying to do is trying to accept the sexual revolution, accept promiscuity and male sexual appetites and so on, but put them into a more orderly and sort of safe and therapy speak container to make them tolerable, mostly for women, I think. It's a way of women processing the existence of the sexual revolution without actually resisting it. I think, have I got that right? That was your argument.
That might be a more intelligent restatement or more interesting restatement of my argument. But yes, it was something like that. The jumping off point, as I recall, was that New York Magazine had this run of cover stories. One, a sort of user's guide to polyamory, right, and then one this not sort of intensely moralistic, but at least somewhat moralistic treatment of the buff, bearded scientist podcaster's multiple affairs, right? I shouldn't say affairs since he's not married. His multiple relationships, and there were people on social media who just said things like, there's this tension here. 1 minute New York Magazine is telling us polyamory is good, and the next minute it's polyamory shaming poor Dr. Huberman. I'm not a regular listener to his podcast, as anyone who examines my physique would know. But yeah, and I thought other people said this, but I thought that was wrong. I think you have to see polyamory as an attempt to do something different than just sort of say, powerful men are going to have a lot of girlfriends, and if they're married, they're going to have mistresses, and that's fine. That's not at all what polyamory is doing. It is trying to sort of negotiate a space where you can have sort of, I think a version of what you just said, but sort of therapeutically managed promiscuity where no one's feelings get hurt and there's no deception, right? The good doctor was engaged in a sort of serial deception of essentially making promises of at least quasi-fidelity to these women, at least with at least one of them. He was trying to conceive a child, I think, right? And none of them knew about the other. And the polyamory is basically saying, well, we can solve all of the unhappiness associated with this kind of behavior, not by, expecting people to be monogamous and be in bourgeois marriages and all of the stuff that, we think is out of date. We can solve it by making sure everyone communicates adequately about their sexual needs and their emotional needs, and that with the right balance of communication, people can be married or in relationships, also have sex with other people, and this will all be liberated and fine right? And female friendly in some sense, right? That this is sort of, in a way, an attempted resolution to some of the issues that that you raised in your own book about the sexual revolution, right? The odd way in which we had a sort of feminist social revolution that ended up sort of defending a sexual landscape that seemed to be oriented more around male sexual desire, right? How do you resolve that tension? Well, if you don't want to be bourgeois or heteronormative or monogamous or Christian, right? You can say, well, we're going to feminize promiscuity, maybe.
Yes, except of course, as you know, humans apparently extremely good at using therapy speak to manage the women in his life. He speaks fluent Californian, right? And that doesn't seem to
Little easy on the Californian, okay?
have been. I mean, what you sort of suspect from it, I don't want to speculate too much on. Have you noticed, by the way, that he is just steamrolling through this? He's just not publicly acknowledged it at all. If anything, his podcast has become more successful. There's been this kind of Streisand effect where it's only done him good. But anyway,
I think that's. I mean, this is a separate kind of discussion, but I think that is just sort of characteristic of the current dispensation, that people have recognized that once you are subjected to an attempted cancellation, right, or whatever we want to call it, right, there is the audience landscape now is sort of segmented enough, and there's enough room to operate without the approval of New York Magazine, that you actually gain nothing by sort of trying to reconcile yourself with or apologize in any way. So yeah, I think that's, I mean, you see that with lots of people now. He's not the only case study, but I think it is a real sort of shift in the landscape from 4 or 5 years ago. Like, he didn't put out a statement saying, I'm growing and learning and seeking my truth, and I apologize to anyone who I have inadvertently hurt. I mean, which he probably would have done had this happened in 2019.
I'm so they're both able to do that, speak so well. It's just very impressive. Now, when I watch people in community and I ask questions about institutions, now there are obviously two kinds of institutions. There are at least two kinds of institutions. There are institutions that are formal and visible, which are like the American government is a mega institution. It's actually a network of institutions. CVS, the drugstore next door to the church, is an institution. Livingstone's church is an institution. There are bylaws. There's a church order. There are rules. There's a board. And then there are these implicit, invisible institutions like marriage. And what's so interesting is that people have opinions about good, bad, right, or wrong, about morality. And I started a video like this, and this wasn't the video. I was just going to do some more on the purgatory thing because I was thinking, I'll just do them because my ideas aren't terribly well formed, but this has sort of been eaten at me, and I've had some other few things that are eaten at me, and then I turn on the camera and it's like, oh no, let's do this. And so I start going down this road, and here we go. So Peterson's got this Foundations of the West thing that's going on Daily Wire. My guess is not a lot of people watching it. I haven't watched it, and anybody at Daily Wire, your Android app still sucks. I pay for your service so I can keep an eye on Peterson a little bit, and I'm really waiting for the biblical series, but your Android app sucks. I would probably have watched all these things already if the Audible Android audio app held its place. And one of the really annoying things that has that bothers people sometimes is if you're listening to it on a Bluetooth device, and then you turn off the Bluetooth device, it'll start playing on the phone. I mean, and this has been true of this Android app for a very long time. And so, I almost unsubscribed, but then I knew, Peterson's going to do the New Testament and I got to watch that and yada, yada, yada. So anyway, yeah, the Android app sucks. So, well, here's a teaser. It's on Open YouTube. And what he says here is, where he starts, I only listened to about the first 4 or 5 minutes of this. And he starts, this is Jordan Peterson 101. These are points that he made all the way back in the original biblical series.
The biblical narrative is at least predicated on the idea that the prophet who speaks the truth has the right to chastise the king. You think, well, where does that idea come from? That's such a preposterous idea. How do you make sense of that idea outside of a religious framework? Or outside of a framework that at least accepts the notion of a transcendental ethic?
Right.
Because the king cannot sin unless there's a pattern of ethics that transcends human kingship. Well, what would that pattern be? When people say, well, I don't believe in God, it's like, well,
but you believe in
what
that,
do you mean?
right?
Yeah, well, what do you mean by that exactly? Do you not believe that the king should have a conscience? Well,
Is it
you
all
might
a
say,
power
well,
game,
that's
right?
just, well, that's right, because then it just devolves into a power game. And then there's no ethics in the power.
And this is, again, a very old point. C.S. Lewis made this point. He sort of leads into Mere Christianity with this point about moral realism and basically wants to undercut reductive materialists and say, well, there's this thing called morality that you all keep pointing to, and it's not physical. It's not sitting around the ground like a bunch of gravel on the side of a levee. It's a very real thing, and you all act as if it's real. That's basically, Peterson's been saying this for a very long time.
Power game. The power game is,
Sure, the king can take Bathsheba. What's the problem?
of course, that's the whole point of the power.
And
Right?
that's the story of paganism too. When it talks in the Bible about man being made in the image of God, I think that what's really interesting is to compare that.
I always feel so they have kind of the main video in this series where they're like he's touring Jerusalem with Ben Shapiro, and he's touring the Parthenon with Spencer Clavin, and then they sit down for a meal. And, here's a nice flatbread and a nice relish and a nice wine. Poor Jordan has his steak and his carbonated water. I feel bad for him. With steak with salt, nothing else. Anyway, on we go.
To texts of the contemporaneous period, where if you read Babylonian texts or if you read Egyptian texts, the description of the king is that the king is made in the image of God. The king is a god in many cases, but the common people are nothing. The common people are just the chattel, they're whatever, they're not part of the history. And the Bible says, no, every person is made in the image of God. And that's really a sea change in how we're supposed to see ethics, because if every person is made in the image of God, then you're supposed to see the face of the other.
And hearkening back to the video that I released this morning, it's very interesting how when they make a point in these little videos, then they do sort of this text thing where these words sort of emerge on the paper. And I did watch the Peugeot Bishop Barron video. I do have thoughts about that. A lot of my thoughts have to do with the fact that Bishop Barron never stops selling. Okay, he's a bishop. I get it. I'm a pastor. I get it. Some people call me a bishop, even though we don't have bishops in the CRC. I get it. But he never stops selling. And I'd love to hear Bishop Barron give and take more and sell less. Anyway. Oops.
And recognize that person is reflective of your face, which is why, David...
It's utterly revolutionary, that idea.
It's an amazing idea. It really is. And we take it for granted because we live in the product of it. And so we tend to forget, what we're rooted in. But it is an amazing idea.
I ask people in my audience often if they believe that. It's like, do you believe that human beings are made in the image of God? Well, let's take that apart. So the first part is, do you believe that human beings contract?
I can't believe I'm just going to talk about this. I'm so bad. I'm just so bad. He's going to talk with his mouth full. He is. But then I figured, if all you're eating is steak, and I'm sure he's eating very good steak, what percentage of your life do you just plain have to devote to chewing? And if you're Jordan Peterson and you love to talk and you've only got steak to eat, you're going to be doing some talking while you're chewing. It's just going to happen. I'm so bad. And, of course, some of you know that I, on occasion, just to have conversations with the female portions of my extended family, I, on occasions, watch The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. And apparently Jesse Palmer was the one that ruined eating on The Bachelor, because apparently, I mean, Jesse Palmer's a big guy, former NFL football player. They'd sit him down for these great meals. They'd be like, "Oh, food, let's eat." He'd sit there shoveling food when you know, the ritual on The Bachelor and Bachelorette is, of course, they have the one-on-one date and then they go out to dinner, and we have such fun trolling that show. And then it's, you know, my son Jared, he's so good at this. He's, you know, tell me your secrets. And it's like, somebody cheated on me. Dum, dum, dum. I'll never cheat on you. What, you mean the other 15 guys you're dating and snogging right now, that doesn't count? It's just so absurd. Oh, I shouldn't do this. Grim Grizz is going to clip the heck out of this. Anyway, back to the main point about morality.
Transform potential into habitable order. Well, do you believe people have free will? Well, no. Well, do you treat them as if they have free will? Well, try treating your wife like she doesn't have free will and see how that works.
It's a great point. I mean, you can drive that point all day long. It is a great point. But you turn it into habitable order, and that's in many ways what these invisible institutions do. And these invisible institutions, which eventually over long periods of time get codified, basically people always complain about what they don't like, but they only feel justified complaining about things that violate these habitable order institutions. And so a lot of what's going on, you talk about re-paganization, and you look at, okay, now in 2019, Andrew Huberman couldn't get away with what he was doing then. It was too close to Me Too. Now he's just doing it. And okay, so where are the lines? What in fact are these habitable order invisible institutions? I got to write that down so I don't forget that. The reason I do these videos is because I come up with ideas and then I got to write them down. And I've also got them recorded now, but I want to get them written down so I can make thumbnails and titles. There, see? Notepad's great. So I watched this Netflix show, The Man with 1,000 Kids, and it was can't take your eyes away TV. So this dude in the Netherlands with long blonde curly hair, it was just an astounding. The show was just a revelation, and now the show is being debated on in the media now. Was Netflix actually representing it correctly? So basically, this guy. So the utilitrads, who are really big on evolutionary psychology, would be the first to tell you that deep down inside of us, our not the secret sacred selves, but our secret corrupt genetic assassin. Genocidal assassins, you know, Bethel was talking about Heather and Eric Weinstein as utilitrads. You know, this little code. Men want to propagate their seed as far as they can, and so apparently some little group of men have figured out not just sort of how to have sex with a lot of women, although they seem to have figured that out too. But how to, in fact, impregnate many, many women and have no financial responsibility for the offspring. And so this guy and apparently his friend who developed this website, and they're just, these dudes are like mixing their sperm together, and I mean, it was more can't tear your eyes away than chimp crazy. And chimp crazy is plenty crazy. So you've got these women, and for one reason or another, often as in this case, a lesbian couple, one of them wants to have a baby and they need sperm. And I'm just thinking, meet Lego, got to get sperm. And of course, there are these sperm banks, but you got to pay money and all this. And what if there was someone out there who would just give you the sperm for nothing? Too good to be true. Now, as with the Huberman question, there was a degree of, let's say, non-full disclosure or sometimes outright lying. But all of these people were really happy. It was fascinating watching them shop for sperm. It's like, oh, the bald dude with the crinkly scalp looks like a skinhead. No, even though this guy was in league with the guy with the long flowing blonde. Everybody, all about the long blonde curls and the dude has his own YouTube channel, and I laughed hard at a lot of places in that show. And so they're all excited. They're all geeked to get this free sperm. And then they want to have a sibling. So then they get another. And one woman's like, he'll go, one couple. The dude had a vasectomy because he was from his marriage. And then he couldn't get it undone. But now he had a new wife. And so he, couldn't give her the sperm. And so the guy first she drives over and gets it from him, and then she gets caught in traffic, so she inseminates herself on the side of the road. And the thing about these shows are, you'll watch them and it's like, I totally believe this. I totally believe she did that. But it didn't take. So then he's like, well, we could do it the natural way. And her and her husband are like, no. But this one woman who had always wanted to be a mom and never found a man who would inseminate her. And again, when they say that, I've probably watched just way too much Home Math. Because it's like, now I think probably she's just never found a man that, that they were both, yeah. But anyway, so then they try with her, but anyway, for the couple, he spends 45 minutes in the bathroom making the deposit in the little cup. And they're down there like, what's taking him so long? But then again, if he's impregnating the world, you would imagine. Anyway, like I said, I'm just watching the show and it's like, oh. I wish I would find this unbelievable, but I found it so very believable. And so then this woman is like, well, the first time didn't take, so not the couple, but a single woman. And she's like, well, we could do it the natural way. So yeah, that's what they did. And I thought, this dude is not only spreading his seed around and having, not fathering these babies, Jordan Peterson talks about mosquitoes, and, he's mosquitoing all these babies. And some of them he's getting, he's getting a chance to do the dirty with random women, which again, evolutionary biologists would say, well, this is a myth. This is Genghis Khan without all of the downside. And then of course, at some point, people began to put two and two together, and they began realizing that not only, is he doing this, but people start knowing other people that he's done it for, and you have all of these half siblings. And then the anger was the super interesting thing, because the ostensible danger, and hey, it sounds like a very legitimate danger. I don't deny it a bit, that, well, some of these half siblings are going to meet each other, and because again, they're biologically close, and the truth is, people do tend to fall in love often with people who are like them. I remember this one couple in college that I thought those two could be twins, and they were not twins, but they in fact fell in love and have children, and friends of mine, etc., etc. But the anger against this guy was so interesting. And then they had to somehow find a law. And then at the end of it, it's one Australian woman who was just so giddy to have controlled this man's reproductive rights. I thought, oh, wow. But it gets down to these questions of institutions. Because here you have a situation where they had never bumped up into something like this before. So there was no implicit institution for it. Now, a lot of people with much more of a traditional worldview would say, yeah, this got going badly right from the start. And there were problems at every step of the way here. But, I don't want to, let me get some cheap sperm on the side. And it's like, this is really how you're doing this, and this is where you're getting the genetic material for the guy who's going to be the father of your children. And so you're too choosy to actually be in relationship with a man, but you're not choosy enough to basically be duped by this dude on the basis, well, who are men to talk? Men get duped because of beautiful hair all the time. But anyway, it gets into this question of institutions, these invisible institutions, these habitable order invisible institutions, and this question of I don't know if it's re-paganization, because we really can't go back. Now, this morning, I think I pulled it up. Yeah, this morning, someone told me that the Distributist had done an essay, and it's both in video form and it's on Substack, and I'll leave a link down below, on the Collinses. And of course, the Collinses are a fascinating couple, and I like them. I just like them, and I watch them a fair amount. I comment sometimes. I've had a conversation with them. We'll probably have another conversation at some point, but Dave Green, the Distributist, does a really nice job of sort of walking through, the problems of the do-it-yourself religion. He talked about destiny with his wife dancing with someone in the background. And what I liked about Dave's piece is that, again, reality is so complex. Combinatorial explosiveness, okay? So complex that part of what we're dealing with is, emergent institutions that are invisible. And as Bethel nicely said, today there are those, Mrs. P. Smith christens the utilitrads, public intellectuals who may not share Chesterton's faith, but like to invoke his fence. I think of Brett and Heather Weinstein, who discuss culture and religion the way they discuss everything else, like evolutionary biologists. They explicitly hat-tip Chesterton in their book, A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, first making the point that we shouldn't lightly assume certain vestigial elements of our body have no purpose, then reiterating this point for our body politics. Yet they themselves, deep, blue, coastal, Jewish atheists, he's Jewish, she grew up Catholic, I believe, that they are still swimming downstream of Christianity. As Mrs. P. Smith dryly puts it, you rarely find utilitrads in society that burns their widows. And I thought that was so true. And so Duthau and Perry get into institutions a little bit.
Marriage, even though that would be a perfectly
But just is.
It's interesting, isn't it, that there hasn't really been a concerted push to legalise polygamous marriage, even though that would be a perfectly sensible thing for campaigners to push for. It has historically been very normal.
And again, the dude who has 1,000 kids, eventually they got they had to find some lawyer who had to figure out, where can we find some law that we can somehow apply to this guy to make him stop? And I was like, make him stop what exactly? Because are you going to, instead of, okay, so he doesn't give to sperm banks anymore. How exactly are you going to police this? You know, if a woman wants to sleep with him, he can't sleep with women anymore. Can't sleep with fertile women anymore. Can't have intentionality. I mean, it just, and so it's like, yeah, polygamy, that isn't on the horizon, but no, with our transhumanist meat Lego 1,000 baby sperm donor Dutchman.
Even within the United States, there has been, as you mentioned, fundamentalist Mormons. And yet there hasn't really been, I guess, well, there could yet be.
Yeah, you've had some progressive jurisdictions take some steps, I think, towards opening benefits of various kinds to multiple partner households, I guess, or something like that, right? But yeah, there's no sense of this as a kind of civil rights crusade in the way that same-sex marriage was. And I think you could see various reasons for that. Part of it is, I think, this idea that we started with, right? That this is sort of, by design, the kind of elite form is supposed to be a mode of experimentation that's supposed to have endless permutations and vary from couple to couple, right? Well, that's quite different from same-sex marriage. The successful claim that it made was that it fit into the relatively simple paradigm of opposite sex marriage, right? So it's harder to say, if your starting point is our model doesn't fit any conventional categories, it's harder to institutionalize it. There's also the taint that attaches to traditional polygamy, right? That, do you want to be launching a civil rights crusade on behalf of fundamentalist Mormons or certain traditional Muslims? I think there's sort of issues with that. But it is an interesting question generally, right? Where you have, you've written a bit about the, just sort of the idea of like Re-Paganization, right? That like what you see in marriage and relationships, you also see in like religious practice, right? Like the Western world has a lot of post-Christian religious practice of various kinds, right? Overt sort of witchcraft and neo-paganism.
And of course, post-Christian religious practice is not identical to pre-Christian religious practice. So I had a wonderful conversation with Julian. Julian's still on the fence as to whether or not we share it. So if you, you can talk to Julian. Julian has an unlisted link to the conversation. If he wants to share it with you, I'm okay with that. But we covered a lot of interesting territory with this. And part, of course, about the entire same-sex marriage debate, which the Christian Reformed Church is in the middle of, is many people are sort of seeing the post-Christian repaganization and saying, well, the heteros have already sort of deconstructed marriage. Why, are we going to just sort of rearrange the rules for 5 minutes right now? Because, all of them are being, we've got to get rid of not only the visible institutions, but the invisible institutions. And do you know what sort of emergent invisible institutions are going to arise? And of course, the thing about these habitable order invisible institutions is that there's going to be a bit of Darwinian reality to them. Now, as I mentioned before, this is just the beginning. Well, let's play a little bit more. A lot of the good stuff was in the subscriber only thing. Sorry, it's not that expensive. And Louise is a really reliable a really reliable source of sort of, okay, heading off into the territory stuff, but with an awareness that you are heading off into the territory and it's wild out there and it's a jungle out there. And do you really want to go there?
Fit into this, hallucinogens, astrology, like, there's a wide range of sort of New Age, neo-pagan, all these kinds of practices that sort of resist institutionalization. Where, nobody is expecting there to be a kind of singular institutional form for post-Christian spirituality anytime soon, even though it's obviously becoming more and more influential in Western culture. And so it sort of exists in this kind of, liminal and inchoate zone, right?
And part of it has been that so many, let's say, New Age attempts. Netflix is full of documentaries about cults, and that's part of what Dave Green goes after in terms of, you know what? There's been a whole lot of people who've been trying to create new religions that don't have all of the awkward, I say accidents, I mean it in a philosophical sense, that don't have all the awkward artifacts of the historical religions. And it just, they just what a picture. Oh, gosh. I'm sorry. And so that when, in fact, you see somebody like Bikram Yoga, he's a guy that comes to mind, he starts sleeping with all the women. And that's part of the point. That there's a landscape here. And when I look at PBS had a little piece that I caught on mega churches, and then one of the first questions out of it as well is why do mega churches, why do so many pastors of mega churches fail? And the guy was like, have moral failure, usually sleeping with somebody. And the guy's like, well, I got absolutely no data to suggest that pastors of mega churches have moral failure more often than pastors of small churches, even though it's probably true, just because pastors of mega churches have higher status and yada, 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 evolutionary biography. Well, we're going to change the rules for them too. And part of the reason Christianity endures is that these are actually very old problems that the church has developed institutions around, and no, there's going to be consequences for that. In Rod Dreer's blog today, one of the things he was talking about was the Roman Catholic sex scandal. Similarly, most Americans have absolutely no idea the role that homosexual networks within the Catholic Church and rooted in seminaries played in the sex abuse scandal. If you read the works of the late sociologist Richard Sipe, a former monk who had become the foremost expert in the sexual habits of Catholic clergy, you get a much clearer picture than you could ever hoped for from the U.S. media. Sipe is very liberal, but he's also a man of integrity who was more faithful to the truth than to ideology. In 2002, Sipe told me on the record as a journalist that gay men should not be admitted to the priesthood, at least not then, not because they weren't capable of being good priests, but because the predatory homosexual networks were so deep and extensive in the priesthood at the time that the same-sex attracted man would face constant pressure to have sex. If he slipped up even once, he was compromised and against his will could be dragged into this corrupt system. It was certainly not the case that all or even most sexually active gay priests were abusers. That's not how it worked, Sipe explained. The abusers were covered up for by the others because they were all breaking the vows of celibacy, and they were bound together by an unspoken vow of silence. You may never feel tempted to have sex with a minor, but your liberty to have sex with other adult men depends in part on your willingness to keep the secrets of fellow gay priests who slept with teenage boys. I have no idea to what extent that rotten system still exists. I can well imagine a lot of it has been cleaned up. Still, did you ever read any of that in the mainstream media at the time? Now, his point is about the media, but if you look like at the Nexium cult, and you look at, these women had to give the top dude basically incriminating photographs or video or stories on themselves to lock them in so they could never betray Nexium the cult. And I read this and it's like, oh, it's the same shtick. It's the same deal. It's not only that you have sort of these habitable order institutions that emerge, you have these corrupt institutions that emerge that actually bind people and keep horrendous things happening. And for that reason, it's not terribly easy to develop something new because you have absolutely no idea the way, if you're successful, thousands of people with their own sinful desires are going to work to corrupt the system and make something absolutely horrendous out of it. Doesn't he have a Scientology picture here too?
End up sort of partially post-Christian, but the actual institutions that we have are still Christian. We still have churches. We still have the institution of marriage, right? Those are the institutions. But then the cultural practices are post, you could say.
Maybe in a funny kind of way, the campaign for same-sex marriage, the access, the campaign to change a Christian institution is essentially what that was, right? It was at a Goldilocks zone historically, where the Christian institution of marriage still had enough cultural power for it to be something that one would want access to.
And I think that's right. And what's interesting about the Christian Reformed Church is that on one hand, Grand Rapids is still in the Goldilocks zone, and a lot of other places that Grand Rapids expected to have as its allies, no longer in the Goldilocks zone.
As someone excluded from it. Whereas now maybe we're into the point where actually the new progressives don't care about accessing traditional Christian institutions because they don't regard them as having any cultural power. So they think, why would I waste my campaigning energies on that? Maybe that, yes.
Yeah, no, it's a hard, because of course there was this struggle within the gay rights movement in the 1990s, early on, especially in the United States, over precisely that question, whether it was worth sort of pushing for membership in a bourgeois, heteronormative, patriarchal, religious infused institution. And the people who won that argument, right, were the conservatives. Andrew Sullivan, the most famous example, the sort of center-right Catholic, in complicated ways, right? His conservatism and his Catholicism are both very complicated, but he imagined himself to be engaged in a conservative project. And I think it's clearly the case that certain forms of same-sex marriage have ended up having a sort of conservative effect, in their sort of immediate impact. But then basically as soon as you had the decisions and changes actually winning the battle for Sullivan, the initiative passed completely to the people who had been opposed to him, right, 10 or 15 years before, which has then yielded the curious situation where, 10 years after the victory of the revolution that he sought, Sullivan is now sort of the famous critic of everything that's happened to the gay rights movement since, right? Transgender issues above all. I don't know if you had somehow delayed the debate by 10 or 20 years. I mean, history doesn't really work like that, right? Debates come along at a particular moment for a reason. But it is an interesting question if you sort of started debating same-sex marriage afresh in 2025, would the radical perspective be more powerful than the Sullivanian conservative perspective? I don't know.
I suppose if we look at the trans issue, which is the next one, at least in the UK, the Church of England has been very eager to embrace trans stuff in any way it can. They're offering things like rebaptizing people in their new gender identity and having trans clergy and all this kind of stuff, like super eager to be open to this new cultural political movement. But I don't really see evidence of trans campaigners caring very much one way or the other about whether or not they're granted access to Christian institutions and Christian forms of status. I think they don't really care. They're interested in accessing other kinds of institutions and other kinds of status, but maybe the radicals have won out and they've decided that actually they're not really playing for the Christian gallery.
Yes, although that may be more true in the UK, where Christianity is more at an ebb and where the Church of England is in a special ebb, right? I mean, I think if you look at debates within Roman Catholicism, I think there's still a kind of clear desirability, a clear sense that like having institutional sanction, religious sanction for this is important, and maybe, obviously it's less important to secular people, but there is, I think, a pretty large constituency that's invested in, say, Pope Francis's friendly gestures to transgender people, and then bitterly disappointed when the Vatican puts out a document reaffirming traditional teaching. I mean, again, I do think that's it's less important than it would have been 25 or 30 years ago. That Catholicism too is just sort of seen as less important than it was when John Paul II was Pope, and Francis sort of stirred a bunch of media interest and attention early in his pontificate because there's sort of interest in him as a liberalizer. But Catholicism per se, if he's not doing something sort of that seems liberal, there's just less interest. But there's still more interest in Catholicism than there is in the unfortunate Anglicans at the moment.
The unfortunate Anglicans. Might have to make that the title of the episode. Yes.
Probably should have. And, I was thinking about Paul de Vries. I talked about his little restatement of the Christian Reform situation. He mentioned, he said, so you've got older people who very much want to see in the Christian Reformed Church, very much, they're taking great offense at this. And he said, then you've got some younger people, of course, there too, but many young people, it's like, I don't really care what the propositional beliefs of the institution are. I just want to go here for this reason. And that might just be sort of the naivete of youth, that they don't understand the implications as things go further. But the culture has changed so quickly. There are real differences in the age groups, in these generational cohorts as you go down. I gotta land this plane here. I'm running out of time. So as they get towards the end of the conversation, Douthat's a little bit flippant with Tom Holland and Tom Holland's position, and I don't think he's kept up to speed on and why would most people pay very close attention to Tom Holland's church attendance. But I do know that Louise Perry and Tom Holland know each other personally, and their path towards Christianity at least has a degree of parallel to it. And so when Douthat was a little flippant with Tom Holland, Louise Perry sort of pulls him back a little bit, and it's kind of like, well, when you're talking about Tom that way, you're also sort of talking about me, and I don't think that's true to my situation. And that's when the conversation gets a little bit more serious. She mentions that Tom, he's actually really very drawn towards the weird and the supernatural side of Christianity, not just towards the intellectual side. And I'm also sort of in the same category. And mentions Justin Brierley. And a little bit later, when Perry sort of lands, for me, I was persuaded. The first hurdle to fall for me was that I was partly, by writing my first book, persuaded of the Christian morality is true in the sense that it produces the best outcomes for people, and so isn't. See, again, these transcripts that I create with AI aren't always the best. And so it isn't, there's therefore a profound sense of true, even if you don't follow everything. And again, this is sort of people, this is what I get so frustrated with I can't think of names today. Trent Horn's video, because this is kind of how people pick up their ideas. as Peter Hitchens notes to Elizabeth Oldfield. This is kind of how they pick up their ideas. And something sort of seems to be true. And there's something there. Jordan Peterson a long time said, we see opportunities and obstacles. And we're watching sort of the dissolution of both the invisible institutions and the visible institutions. And we're beginning to notice that without these institutions, things are getting chaotic, and we don't quite know how to judge it. We don't quite know how to navigate. And so then we sort of look back and say, yeah, but maybe those Christians, they weren't so dumb. And yeah, I'm not so sure about everything that they believe. And this is part of the point that I want to get to in that purgatory video. So I'm not going to quit that purgatory video with Peugeot and Roland, because that was an excellent video. Because I'm not sure that the propositional storehouses of the religions are necessarily as modernist emissarians like to believe they are. I suspect that at least part of the propositional distinctivenesses between formal Christian institutions is in fact for the purpose of differentiation. And I'll get into that when I get further into that video, because there were some, I remember listening to that video and having that insight. They didn't make that insight directly, but they were talking about, and again, this very much has to do with the distributist critique of this of the Collins's religious enterprise. That the fact is that the reason these things emerge, and part of the multiple particularities that emerge, and the fact that competing groups fight over these particularities, even if those particularities aren't necessarily operating in the way that everybody thinks they are, that the particularities themselves are part of what, of course, gives particular groups cohesion, which is very important for the group, because as human beings, we just simply need cohesion. We just simply need other people. We just simply need to belong to a tribe, which gets into Meg and Dom's conversations about the community, the gay community, the black community. And I was having a conversation with someone today offline, and I said, you never hear anybody talk about the heterosexual community. Because if we heard somebody say the heterosexual community, we'd all just sort of laugh, because it would seem absurd. Well, I speak on behalf of the heterosexual community. That's just silly. I speak on behalf of all humankind. Who are you talking to? Space travelers? We'll leave that aside for now. What did he say? He's leaving that aside? Is he talking to space travelers? Have the men in black visited living stones in their long black Cadillacs and knocked on the door and told me to no longer make videos about UFOs? I'll leave that for those of you who love such things. So I've got to land. And I'm still not. No, that was where I wanted to go with this. And so she says, I struggle with the claims, and of course this is exactly where Richard Dawkins and Ayaan Hirsi Ali are. Ayaan Hirsi Ali says, I'm seeing patterns that I want in on, because I realize I need institutions around me, both the invisible and the visible, and because they create habitable order. And so if it means coalescing with this Christian tribe and doing some of their things, I mean, really, an hour a week sitting in a pew, listening to some music and singing along, and maybe listening to that little talk and having a tiny little snack at the end, does that cost so much? Well, of course, the deeper you get into it, you realize, yeah, it really can cost you a lot. But by that point, it isn't a coercion. It's the desire to have it. The desire to have him. So, yeah, that should do it. This went on longer than I expected. And some of you say, I really like the messy videos. Well, I turned the camera on, and it just kept flowing. It just kept flowing. So there you have it. Hope it was helpful. leave a comment.